And in this first session, we open with, we're ready to open, Michael? We're ready to run? We open with lights and music. First, I would like to introduce Roger Foley-FOGG. Roger is one of the creative geniuses behind many of the seminal 60s music experiences in Australia. If there was a dramatic light show accompanying the concerts you attended, as I did, in Sydney, Sydney, Melbourne in particular I go, but throughout Australia as well.
And Southeast Asia.
And Southeast Asia generally. Well, chances are Roger was weaving his magic. While constant reference is made in the volumes about the 1960s that are still being published on a daily basis, constant reference is made to the soundtrack of the 60s. It's really important to remember also the design accompaniment to that soundtrack, whether album covers, and Roger's friend Martin Sharp, of course, was responsible for many of those, which I thought were going to be laid around here, Michael, but we haven't got up yet. Or light shows, or even fashion. These design elements of the dance experience and the countercultural experience as a whole were really vital. Roger has reflected recently on his experience at the Yellow House in Sydney in the foundation issue of the, what I'd like to think of as extraordinary online journal Counterculture Studies. And we are most pleased that he is giving the opening address to this workshop. Roger.
Thank you very much. And I pay my respects to the spirits and the reality of the original Australians, which is what I like to call Aboriginal Australians. And this is a wet show. This was done in the late 60s, about the time of 68. And we discovered that wet shows, when they were done correctly, would work with any kind of music, and they were great meditation devices. And so we filmed this on 16mm, and it's been converted to beta, this and that. Now it's on a USB stick. So there are other effects happening at the same time. 3 people did that. And I used it quite a few times. Even today, young people want to see it. But primarily my interest was that light shows were an expression of joy. As an artist, my starting point seemed to be to help folk experience joy. But that simple goal raises a question about our ecstatic feelings, our body electric. Why do we suffer from the law of diminishing returns? How can we stay positive in a world that keeps questioning the meaning of life and finding only a negative response? Rightly or wrongly, I blamed it on what I knew of the French existentialists and the gloomy outlook on life by many otherwise intelligent people whom I met at university. To be happy, to experience joy, was seen to be simple-minded. Or perhaps folk had a forewarning of what was to come in our bloody politic. I always suspected that great artists like Martin Sharp had the ability to time travel. The next movie now, please, Michael. Not knowing of Aristotle or Aquinas at the time, my young friends, my generation, understood that we have a duty to change unjust laws. In the trial of Nazi Adolf Eichmann in 1962, we were excited by the judge's decision that obeying the law of the state was not a defence for murder, which convinced us that to experience joy through doing good, we have a duty to change bad laws. And the only way to change bad laws is to break them. By 1968, the Vietnam War had led our generation of students to invest themselves in the same process of change by breaking bad laws. That year, 1968, I was busy doing light shows. Everyone and every subculture needed some kind of lighting or light show for their events and happenings. I got to meet a lot of wide collection of society. And by a kind of osmosis, my light shows and Albie Tom's light shows became part of the counterculture and also part of the sexual revolution, which began for me in the 50s. The Kinsey reports of the 40s and 50s, rediscovered in the 60s, the publication of Playboy magazine in 1953, from 1953, the visit of Lenny Bruce in 1962, the research of Masters and Johnson from 1966, and the unrestricted availability of the pill, the contraceptive pill from 1972, when the Yellow House was in full swing. The explosion of protest in print began on university campuses and carried on by some of my fellow speakers here today. I still have copies of Thoronka and The Digger. I had heard that the Paris Revolution of 1968 began when male and female students were refused permission to visit each other's bedrooms at night. This edge of the sexual revolution tipped France into a deep examination of contemporary life that quickly became a worldwide movement that reshaped our world by breaking the social, cultural and political paradigms of the times. It was a revolution of the global village, and the global village was knitted together by rock and roll. Mass communication through television delivered rock and roll as my generation's agitprop. The symbolism of long hair and the exploding sexual revolution and drug taking were allied to anti-war protests and civil rights movements under the banner Counterculture, a wild dancing mass that celebrated equality, be it racial or sexual, the rights of Indigenous people, Aboriginal Australians, the rights of queer people and the ideals of multiculturalism embedded in popular music, an art form that defied national, political and cultural barriers. It was a global enterprise played out under blazing lights and light shows. And in Australia, most of this phenomenon was generated by Albie Tom's Ubu group and by my group, Foley-FOGG. I met Albie Toms when I was at university through our mutual interest in theatre. When the Ubu group and the FOGG group began producing light shows in the late 60s, we became friendly rivals, swapping and sharing our various technologies that were being invented for our shows. Later, Albie asked me and many others to proofread his book, My Generation, which still remains the best and most thoroughly researched record of that 60s era. I get angry when folk deny Albie's contributions. For example, Philip Adams on radio has introduced a radio segment by saying, "Here's George Gittos, who with Brett Whiteley began the Yellow House." A statement left uncorrected. In Martin's own words, in the catalogue for the exhibition Larrikins in London, he wrote, "Albie Toms and I started the Yellow House." Albie was the most painstakingly careful archivist of those times, and I recommend his books, published after he died. He went to great lengths to get the story right. Many of us proofread it for him, but sadly, it's hard to buy. And more recent books about that period are full of errors. He gave me a digital copy, which I might stick up on the internet one day. Albie and I worked together doing light shows several times after Ubu. I tried to convince him that his great film, Marinetti, did not work as a narrative film in a cinema because of the expectations that an audience has when confronted by a rectangular screen. At the premiere of that film at the Sydney Film Festival, he was dismayed that most of the audience walked out. But the film worked very well when combined with light shows for a free-flowing audience. He took my advice and we showed the work several times with my light shows before he died. When light shows took off, I dropped out of university and I dropped out of art school, early Sydney Tech. Later, I was inspired and amused when my old university philosophy tutor in the Whitbread wanted to come and work on our fog light show projects, which he did for several years. In a personal way for me, this announced the viability of my position in the counterculture. We're just looking at life in ponds. A friend, John Walsh, now sadly deceased, came to see me in the late 60s, very excited to show me a film he'd made. He was a world leader in the research of our small world through microphotography. He still has a big website up. Filmed through a microscope, it shows two single critters having a good time. He told me the correct name for these creatures. I had to write it down, there's too many syllables, and sadly I can't find that note. Our excitement was not only the living creation of the yin-yang symbol, but also the fact that these critters were not doing this to reproduce. They were doing it for fun, for pleasure, for joy. As you know, the straighteners, our rulers, religious and other control freaks, we call them, were screwing up people's lives by convincing them that it was unhealthy to use sex for anything other than reproduction. Stop it or you will go blind. However, this little movie proved otherwise. The primal instincts for pleasure expressed through the will to be close together displayed in this movie seemed to prove them wrong. Which brings me to Richard Neville. My mother, an intelligent bohemian spirit who'd been constrained in her dreams of becoming a lawyer by the worldwide depression of 1929 and the death of her mother through medical malpractice, she had encouraged my interest in art. I had started experimenting with refracted and reflected light as a very young boy, about 8 or 10, with my bicycle torch and bits of bathroom glass. Mum sent me off to craft classes run by Joy and Betty Rayner, two well-known independent-minded entertainers who lived in a caravan in Centennial Park. They taught me puppet making and working with clay. Mum was a friend of Betty Neville, Richard Neville's mother, and spoke of Richard as that naughty boy, Ricky Neville. As a 12-year-old, Richard Neville had sent money off to America with a form in the back of a magazine and bought a gun. She said, that naughty boy, Ricky Neville, with a smile on her face. And I wanted that look for me. So I started being naughty myself. And Richard's doings inspired me, liberated me. While I'm basically a person who works in the wings, not on set stage, like people see the actors on the main stage, whatever they're doing, even when the curtains are closed, we see what they are really like. I was influenced by Ricky's phenomenal energy and bravery. So in a sense, Richard liberated me. Maybe I was the first person he liberated. And interestingly, my wife, who's in the room with me today, at about the same time, as a young black girl in Harlem, New York, with 2 babies to bring up, was liberated when her boyfriend suggested she audition at the Playboy Club. And she became one of the first black Playboy bunnies in the New York Playboy Club, and then moved to LA to open the Playboy Club there. Became a great friend of all the other bunnies and all the blokes. And then when the federal directive announced that film studios had to hire minority groups, at that time there were no black people working in the film industry, no women working in the film industry, other secretaries. She got a job in the film industry in Los Angeles and worked as an assistant film editor. So she was liberated at about the same time. Martin Sharp. It was a measure. Wish it put the very head of Raxus still on there. Okay. It was a... Sorry. Let's put Martin Reed on, actually. It was a measure of the spiritual and practical connection that Martin Sharp had with everything that was going on that led him to paint Abraxas in 1968. Strangely and synchronously, that was also about the time that my friend Gretel Pinninger, an art student, started performing in King's Cross strip clubs to earn money. Her whip act at Madame Lash was called Abraxas. Also strangely, as a measure of the angst felt by some members of the Yellow House commune after Martin left the place, due to an argument about money and the border clashes between different artists, the painting Abraxas was purposefully smashed. I rescued the work and with Martin's approval started restoring it with the aim of making and selling posters of this great work so that I could pay for the restoration of the work and for the restoration of the films that I was making. Because as I was doing light shows, I realised it was quite an exciting time. Lots of people doing exciting things. So I filmed everything that moved. I was just recording what people were doing. I met Martin in '66 when I asked him if I could use some of his cartoons in the University Review. For example, who could forget his take on the mating habits of North Shore schoolboys? The word flashed round the arms. There was his gas turn up along Whale Beach Road. So we all got into the minis and thrashed over. Now the father of the bird that was having the turn said we couldn't crash. So Sid hit him. And then Sid chucked in the TV set. God, it was funny, etc., etc. There have been 2 books written about Martin, one in 2 parts by Lowell Tarling, who was advised by Martin to buy a small tape recorder to record the daily happenings at Wirion, Martin's home. You will need it, said Martin. Lowell has over 100 hours of tapes of their conversations, and with a few small errors has written the defining books on Martin's life about his eccentric friends. And there is another book by Joyce Morgan, a slender volume, which is a good read for someone who is wondering who Martin Sharp was. However, I was astounded at the launch of Joyce's book that Richard Neville, her publisher, took it upon himself to spend several minutes being very rude to many of Martin's friends and criticising Lowell's books. And criticising Martin's eccentric friends.
Roger Walsh.
Richard Walsh. You said
Richard Walsh. I'm sorry, Richard Walsh. Did I say the wrong Richard?
Yes.
There you go. You know, I'm not used to public speaking. I'm usually in the wings. You know. Richard Walsh, the publisher, took it upon himself to spend several minutes being very rude to Martin's eccentric friends. And laughingly, he denied Martin's eccentric friends an entry to the book launch through having heavy security at the door. I got in by the skin of my teeth. And several singers, musicians and other artists who Martin loved were not allowed in. I thought that was astounding. What's going on here, I thought? Is it nasty rivalry between different publishers? Is history being rewritten for some purpose? Martin loves eccentrics. Tiny Tim he loved. Les Bean he loved. Harold the Kangaroo. Boom Boom the Balloon. Fifi Lamore. And later on he loved Jesus of Nazareth. And all of us who march to a different drive. We are important for a healthy society. In the mid-19th century, 1859 to be precise, Harriet Taylor Mill, not so well known, and her husband, John Stuart Mill, better known, wrote an essay on liberty. Somewhere inside it states out that the amount of genius mental vigour and moral courage in a society is generally proportional to the amount of eccentricity in that society. I just added that bit to this speech yesterday and tried to Google to check my words. But when I Googled John Stuart Mill, I found myself in a quarry on an ore crushing machine, the John Stuart Mill. So I don't trust automatons. I'd like to leave you with just 2 minutes of Richard Neville, my great dear old friend, who in 2 minutes sums up the sexual and countercultural revolution. Somebody gave me this paper. Got sound?
You don't seem to have sound, Roger.
The sound on it.
I know. Sound is
Well,
up for.
the lip readers.
Could be on the program itself.
There's something registering up there, so it should be.
Yeah. Oh dear. Looks like we haven't got it, Roger.
It's in my
Yeah, that's up full.
That's up full.
The noise.
No, there's nothing coming.
No, it would have, if it were
Ding,
ding.
It's really bad.
And the software itself, the
Just keep talking, I'll see if I can.
Well, are there any questions? I've come to the end of my list.
Roger, can we thank you for a terrific questions indeed. We've got at least 5 minutes before the next paper, so. Henri.
Not a question, but you've been too generous to the French, thinking that they had a gender equality in the 60s, you see. Because it's true that what sparked the whole May 68 in France was due to a woman having a man in the residence. But there was an inequality. The men were allowed to have women in the student residence, not the women.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And in fact, a woman was expelled for having a man, and that is the first initial reaction of a few people went to protest. There was in Nanterre University, started, and the whole thing developed from there.
Well, thank you for that illumination. There you go.
It's typical of blokes, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
No, we want to have a gender equality. We are very generous now.
there are many people here with different experiences of the 1960s, but Henri's in 1968 was of France, but of rural France, if my memory serves. I'm not Paris, France, right?
But
Lyon, was it? Lyon?
No, Bordeaux. But
Bordeaux.
the thing is, it's the whole, because everything was centralized in France, we only talk about Paris, but there were other things, elsewhere, and where people died in other places, and that's not known at all.
Yeah.
Wendy, you have a question.
Yes, Roger, I wanted to ask you two things. One very sort of storyline. What actually happened to the Yellow House? Like you're talking about earlier in the 60s, before 1968. I wasn't in Sydney in those years, so, but I remember going to the Yellow House and have been there, so I'm just wondering what happened to it. I'm also wondering how, looking back, you left the university to go off and do all these exciting things. How did you see your relationship with people like, say, Hall Greenland at Sydney Uni and the kind of more organised left people? How did you see that or experience it at the
Occasionally,
time?
they would invite me to provide light shows for their talks, but I found them a little dry, I've got to say, and just that's me personally. You know. I guess I'm a show business type person, you know. And but I knew them all, you know, and I knew Germaine too. But I was terrified of Germaine. She was terrifying. And I was very shy. I was a bit shy of you too. You were quite amazing in those years too.
Someone's coming.
Good. So that's really interesting. Thank you for that illumination. So,
But you didn't answer, darling, you didn't answer her question about
The Yellow House, what happened?
Oh, the Yellow
The
House.
Yellow
The
House.
second question. Okay. Well, I direct you to Lowell's books. Lowell went to a lot of trouble to get the Yellow House story right. The building started off as the Clune Galleries, where Pamela Clune decided to lead. It was then loaned to Martin for his first exhibition when he came back from London, and we just called it the Martin Sharp Gallery then. And then that went so well, then they decided that Martin went back to London. That's when he had the conversation with Albie about let's recreate Vincent van Gogh's dream. In 1888, Vincent had a dream of a yellow house with a group of artists. He ended up with one artist there, and it didn't last very long because they sort of imploded. Got on. And then, so on April the 1st, 1971, that's when the Yellow House opened as the Yellow House. But it had been different galleries before then. And it lasted about 7 months. And then there were internal corruption. Is that my time up?
Still working on that.
And then there was, basically more and more artists joined the group. I was invited to join the group for the second opening, because I had a show in Watter's Gallery with Vivian Binns, which was very successful. And so Martin and Albie invited me to do put an installation into the Yellow House. We called them environments in those days, before the environment took over the word environment, So it's installations now. And then there wasn't all sweetness and love and peace, all the time. It was because as artists painting one wall and the other artist painting one, they'd meet and there'd be conflicts. There was a conflict in the stone room. As Brett Whiteley saw what was going on in the Yellow House, said, hey, look, they're becoming more famous than me, he better get involved in this. And he started painting the Clockasai wave in the stone room. But Brett was painting all the little fingers at the end of the wave, you're familiar with it, I'm sure, as little sperm. And he'd be there early in the morning doing that because Martin slept all day, and Martin would get down there at night and go, what the hell, So he'd paint over the sperm and turn them back into claws. And this happened over a couple of days, and Martin got so angry eventually. Martin could be very angry at times. And he ended up throwing a hammer at Brett. And Johnny Lewis saw that. And then there was an argument about money. The house had been given free. Electricity bills had to be paid. People were charging $1 at the door. But, that wasn't very slack. We weren't very good at money. And the owner of the building said to no, maybe they should. Some of the people should start paying rent. Albie Thomas objected to this because he'd spent a year there, working flat out every day, creating the place, and was now expected to pay rent for the same, so he didn't. That was the nub of the argument, and that's why they all drove off in 6-cylinder Huffs in different directions. But they left their artwork behind. And Sebastian Jorgensen then took over the place. And he started booking rock and roll bands in. He had the Oz band that he put together, which was Mick Conway. And Renee Gayo actually launched her first record there. So it had quite a good run as a music venue. Tim Burns' artwork stayed there, my artwork stayed there. But all this is better spelled out in Lowell's books.
Thanks very much for a terrific talk.
Sorry?
I found it really interesting, thanks. It was a great talk.
Yes, I'd like to thank you. I'm sure we'll have time for questions, and if not formally, then informally over morning tea as well. There's a nice group here to